Hello, my name is Elena Huseinova, and I am inviting you to 28th Lviv International Book Forum. As far as we are still living in the pandemic times, this very event is online event. But we are sure that great poets, great poetry, and great poetry performances, also as good talks with poets, are worth of sitting behind your laptops or smartphones and watching us. So right now you are dear guests of Hasa Shiyan program on Lviv Book Forum, Writers' Insights. And it is supported by Ukrainian Cultural Fund and Center for Creative Arts, University KwaZulu-Natal. And now I am introducing the center figure of our event, Sіпоказі Йонас, writer, poet, performer, and producer. She is based in Cape Town, hails from Komani in the Eastern Cape. She started writing poetry in high school and represented herself to the world of spoken poetry as a student. In 2017, she quit her job to work with poetry full-time. It isn't easy job, and she explains such her words in the way Ukrainian poets explain very similar theses. Poetry is still very niche, and finding audience is challenging. Welcome to Ukraine. Just a couple days ago on your Twitter, you write such a text. I am so excited to be taking part in the Lviv International Book Forum this September. If it weren't for COVID things, I would be headed to participation. We'll have to do for now. Why it is excited to go into this part of the world, to so-called Central Europe?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really happy to be able to join you. I think, in fact, if you look below that tweet, there was someone from, I believe it was Sweden, who actually responded and said that Ukraine is the center of beautiful literature, readers, poets, writers. So it's seen as a hub of literary, incredible literary works, but really creativity as well. It came highly recommended by a friend of mine, Oksana, who's in Pretoria, who I'd actually met at the Poetry Africa Festival in 2017. So there's always been this yearning to come and see it for myself and to experience, the love of poetry, the love of multiple genres actually, and to see what that culturally, especially that experience, what it's like on the other side of the world. So that's why I would love to come in person one day.
Yeah, but I am actually the only person from Ukraine you will have chance to communicate, and unfortunately I have no opportunity to go with you to drink coffee or wine or to show you my favorite places or just to chat and so on and so forth. And all this because of COVID. Do you feel that all these COVID things which made us less mobile, made us also more inscrutable, more close?
I think it's sort of a two-way kind of experience, the way that I've experienced it over lockdown since last year. So certainly there is a way in which we've been closed down, physically limited to the spaces that we're at, as well as the fact that we have to interact through a screen as we're doing now. So I think there is that isolation that has happened that has made it difficult to actually connect to other people, but to find community as well. So, for example, I love going to the theater. I work in the theater, but we haven't been able to do so. Right, it's been really difficult to actually go, and especially because we have such low vaccinated numbers or vaccination rate in South Africa at the moment. And so the sense of being able to gather, especially because I'm a spoken word poet, so I rely on a live audience to be able to kind of respond and connect to the work that I do. That part has certainly changed, and it has made it difficult to reach our audiences in a certain way. But on the other hand, we are finding more opportunities like this one, for example, right, that make it possible for us to connect to a wider audience. So in a way, the local experience has shrunk, but the global experience for me has expanded, because in one of the productions that we filmed recently, we've now started having an international audience for that work, which would not have been possible if we were just staging it here in South Africa. But now you'll have people in Jamaica, people in the Philippines or in India, connecting and streaming that work. And so it feels as if while the physical body or the geographical experience itself has shrunk, but there's kind of a global cultural connection that's happening that I think is exciting. Yes, it's secondary in that it's not, as you say, we'd love to be able to go to coffee and walk around and see everything. But while we're waiting, there's a greater sense of cultural connection that I'm finding.
Have you been through a lot of virtual participation in different poetry events through this time, COVID times?
So, let me think. Yes, certainly in the beginning, because I think what happened in the beginning of lockdown is everyone started having Facebook Live events and Instagram Live and all of those things. And so there was that almost urgent response to what we were experiencing, with people trying to get as many events online as possible. And I have been in a number of those. One of the most interesting ones that I had recently, we actually put together a poetry event on Twitter Spaces. So that is audio only. And what I loved about this, it's almost like listening to the radio or listening to a podcast. But what I loved about it is that it took the pressure of a video away, because I think we're all feeling fatigue around Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all of these things, and having to, dress up just the upper half of your body. So it actually took the pressure off, so you could literally be lying in bed, or you could be in the kitchen or wherever, but you're actually on your phone and you're sharing poetry. And there was something that felt more like that live experience actually than sitting down and being in front of Zoom. So I'm interested where the audio aspect of poetry will go.
I like this story very much, because I am a radio host, and I feel the beginning of Pandemia, of COVID times, I feel like my time. Yes. You are a very free person, and you feel yourself very lucky, because just your studio and your voice, everything you need, and a little bit of connection like Skype or some other things, and you put inside of your story a lot of voices, and I feel very very comfortable in the beginning of the pandemic inside of my voice profession. But do you think this time of COVID has been changed your personal way of poetry performance? Because you deal with poetry, you deal with language, and you deal with theater, and you have a couple of work where you are a performer, like in cinema or like in theater. It's your part of identity and your part of your professional identity. Whether this virtual presentations, virtual life of poetry, of spoken poetry, has been changed your way of poetry performance.
Certainly. I think the biggest change has been the move towards the screen. So I've been filming a lot more poetry rather than live performance. So, for example, if I get commissioned to write something for a specific event, the likelihood now is that we will go and record that and film that maybe in a studio or on location. So we'll have the location and kind of have that live shoot there. So it has changed because my sense of audience has shifted. Usually I have the audience in front of me in a theater, and we're able to interact, and you can pick up certain clues from what they're listening to, right? So you've got that live interaction when you know that your performance needs to go somewhere because of where the audience is. Now, it's almost like having published poetry where the audience is imagined, because now what I have is a film crew. Maybe I have the director, I have the DOP, or I have the camera person in front of me, and I'm performing into a lens. I'm just performing into a camera, or I'm performing into 3 cameras. And so the sense of audience is more imagined for me as I think about who's going to listen to this, but also how do I recreate that live experience for them in front of a camera. So it is challenging in its own ways, but also I think there's intimacy in front of a camera because it's right there, and being able to focus and really bring the authenticity and the nature of what you're doing into a camera lens has been, I feel like it's stretched me. It's given me more to work with, actually.
Pandemia as a theme of poetry. Do you use it? I know you use it. I find your poem about Pandemia, and we will talk about it just in a couple of minutes. But Pandemia is a theme of poetry. Do you like to hear that other poets are reflecting on this theme? How you react on the theme inside of poetry, different poetry, and do you think that somehow vocabulary of the poems are changed because of Pandemia? The words COVID, vaccinate, and so on and so forth are come inside these poems, new poems.
So I've only written 2 poems about the pandemic. I don't really enjoy, I don't know how to explain this. So for me, I don't really enjoy making it the main theme of the work. I'm more interested in how the world is changing as a result of the pandemic rather than the pandemic being the theme itself. I think, first of all, it's something that we're still learning about. It's constantly changing. 6 months ago, a year ago, what we thought we knew about, first of all, who we are as people, what we thought we knew about our place in the world, what we thought we knew about power structures, all of those things are constantly being challenged. And I almost feel like I don't have enough information yet to kind of make it an interesting story. There's something almost uninteresting about the pandemic, if I can put it like that. But what is interesting for me is, the dissolution of community around death and the ritual of death, right? So it's more what its impact has been, because, for example, I'll make an example about the rituals around funerals that we have, especially in Black cultures in South Africa. Usually it would take about 2 weeks before, between the passing of a person and the actual funeral. And in that time, you have people coming to whoever is mourning. They would come from around the country and find ways of actually supporting them. You'd have daily meetings, often prayer meetings where people come from different places, different pockets of community coming in to support the family. And then eventually, over that 2-week period, it's a way of the community to show its support to the mourners, to say we're mourning this together as a community, together as a family. Now that's impossible. What would take about 2 weeks probably happens in about 3 or 4 days. Maybe at most up to a week. And then you have limitations of only having 50 people that can actually attend a funeral. So something that could have hundreds of people in the past. Because, culturally, that's something that we carry together is now impossible. So that for me is more interesting than the pandemic itself. And I've been trying to limit, bringing it into the poetry. Like, I haven't written about vaccination. I don't know. It just doesn't. It hasn't given me enough nuance yet and enough of a story. And I've almost like there's very little poetry in the idea of vaccination. But how people respond and the tension between who thinks what and what it means when you're vaccinated, what it means if you're against vaccination, what's under. So it's a subtext. It's what's under that about how people are responding to this time. I think we were very optimistic in the beginning that society is going to change. You know, the dolphins are back, and that, you know, you saw when people being inside, nature was responding to our absence. People being inside means suddenly you had you know, deer walking in the street, and there was this optimism within society that, oh, the earth is healing. But as soon as we came out again, that has not happened. So we've kind of gone back exactly to where we were. So I'm interested in human behavior in response to crisis rather than the crisis itself. Yeah.
I like your poem about Pandemia, the one I read, very much. I think that's the best one about pandemic times I ever read through all this time. And for example, this line, the artist who contemplates eating her own words to ease her hunger and art straves. It's all about us, yeah, of all poets through the world. It is never mind where you are living in Ukraine or South Africa, and then when I read this poem till the end, I understood that it sounds as if some of Ukrainian poets write it, especially in such lines. We are people who know how to build our way of the remnants of disaster, and we will do it again and again. Or people who have learned to breathe underwater, reciting the names of those who were lost and memories that never cease. And it is very recognizable when you read this poem that it's not about pandemia or not about COVID-19, and it is not even about this pandemic times. It is about all the times of our culture and our history. And I feel this very close to myself and my experience, this feeling of being invisible for the whole big world, and this feeling of our own memory and our own text, which are the only places to keep our dead and their stories, and so on and so forth. And this, like you always hear, like, and I read this poem like a poem about cultures and about countries, which the most time of their history and their everyday life, they live as in pandemic times. And then it happens with the whole world, and all these people, they do not know how to live, and we know that we find the way out. And we are not sure this way is okay for other countries and for other cultures. And it's very, very similar and very, very recognizable for me. Do you feel some astonishment about such accordance? We are so far from each other. We are in Europe and you are in Africa. It is ocean between us. And then this experience is so similar, and it needs so similar words. And it is very colonial experience. Do you feel some astonishment? And how and whether I am the first person who speaks with you about this accordance between such cultures as South African and Ukrainian?
Oh, I'm not surprised. I'm not astonished at all, because just as you said, it is a colonial experience, and I think that for the brutality of colonialism. And there's a similarity within that project. really also what it has left behind. Because we often say, as much as the rules, the laws themselves may have been negated, but we still live with the legacy of colonialism. We still live with the power structures of that oppressive system, and it's ongoing. And also to think about how the world can deny the reality of ongoing oppression within society. So, for example, a few months ago, we did a poetry reading in solidarity with Palestine. And there has been, and sometimes you wonder why there's even still a debate about what's happening. But coming from South Africa, a country that was under apartheid for a long time, I was born, I think maybe about 6 years. I was born in 1986, and our first democratic elections were in 1994. So growing up in that towards the end of apartheid, and mostly actually coming into being my own identity in the years of transition between apartheid and the beginnings of democracy. So the despair and the enthusiasm and the hopefulness for a democratic society, I think for countries that recognize that, for countries that have gone through that, we have so much that we share. We have so much in common, even if there are very specific historical contexts that are different, for example, between Ukraine and South Africa. But I think the legacy and the experience thereof is something that we can share. And poetry, for me, is able, again, to transcend those geographical borders and share and speak about a kind of shared experience.
Do you interested in Ukrainian poetry to find this accordness between your texts, your experience, and experience of the poets here?
So I think because of the language, there's obviously a bit of that barrier. As I said, I came across 2 Ukrainian poets that were so I've read their poetry, Oksana. And then I can't remember the second poet, but there were 2 poets. We were all in the same, we were all performing and reading at the same festival.
Olena, Anna.
I'd have to look it up. I may send the name to you afterwards. But they were the 2 Ukrainian poets. That's the first time I'd actually come across Ukrainian poets, especially in that format. And so, I was so taken. I was truly, and they actually read translations. I think one had projected the English translation. So the English was actually on the projection in the back, and so she wasn't reading in English, and that already was something that was so intriguing to me. And I found, especially around thinking about feminism, thinking about the experience of women, which is what Oksana was reading a lot about. I found so many similarities, so many overlaps. And there's also something, I think, painful about the realization that we share struggle. I would love for us to share joy, to share the beauty. And those things are there, but there's always that recognition of struggle and the impact of oppression within different within our experiences, and that does make me sad. That is heartbreaking in its own way. But I think there was also the beginning of a translation project that was happening between the 2. So the more English translation that we can get, that would be amazing.
The thing I was thinking about while I was reading this poem about pandemic is this feeling of being the other. I'm white, and I am living very near. I am living in Europe, just 6 hours to go to Poland, for example, and 12 hours to go by car to Vienna. But if I am in Warsaw, or I am in Vienna, or I am in Paris, Europeans, they are just in a minute understood that I am the other. I don't know how it's happened. I speak English like all others, Central European people. Yeah, yes. I'm wearing some clothes, but in a minute, I understood that I am the other. I am from post-Soviet territory, and this feeling of very visible otherness, I read it in this poem, and I feel it like a very important question and very important theme, which is which poetry works very good.
Yes, so I mean that's so interesting. That's so I would have never thought of it quite in that way, because a lot of my work does speak about this negotiation of otherness. So for me, it is definitely about skin color, right? And I live in Cape Town, which is sometimes seen as a kind of pseudo-Europe. I think people who come to South Africa and come to Cape Town specifically are able to recognize, even in the architecture, they see something of Europe. There's a way in which it's sort of emulated that aspiration for the West in Cape Town. But it also goes further because of the planning. So during apartheid, what you had was division of living areas according to race. So you'll have areas that have a majority of Black people, areas that are a majority of colored people, areas that are majority of white. So even if there has been some movement, and there are some Black people in historically white areas, for example, but there are ways in which moving through the city with my skin color is difficult. Or you feel let me give an example. This wasn't my personal experience, but it's being shared, where in some areas, even if you walk into a restaurant, the waiters won't really come to you, or that you maybe get served last, right? So the sense of you don't belong here, and even here in Africa, here in South Africa, there is that experience. And so my work speaks to that movement around the city, movement around the space, but also language. So because of colonialism, obviously English became the language. That was the colonizer's tongue, and English was the language that most of us were taught in. And yet the other ways in which I feel othered is when I go home, especially to my mom's village, then my inability to speak my mother tongue properly is something that others me. So I constantly feel like I'm in between these two worlds, where even when speaking English is seen as something that's outside or alienates me from my culture. And yet when I'm trying to come back or trying to gain access back into my culture, I don't have the right kind of isiXhosa, and so I think poetry for me has been a way of speaking to that, of exploring that. But also now, I think in the last 2 or 3 years, I've started trying to write more in my mother tongue. And I don't do it well, but I'm trying, because I think I'm trying to claim back something of my identity without the pressure of actually doing it well and saying, hey, it may not be perfect, but it's still part of me, and I'm reclaiming that, and I'm going to keep working at it.
I was when I was 20, I started to speak in my ordinary life and to write in Ukrainian. But before I was 20, I use Russian language. And while I was in school and in university, I was working with Russian language. It's like it's very not the same thing, but I understood this desire to go back to your own language, to take this language for yourself. And now we will speak about this, because a couple hours ago I read in your Twitter that you will read an Isikosa poem today, and because of this poem you want to speak about language and upbringing. And Isikosa is one of the official languages of South Africa. And in Ukraine, we call it Mova Kosa. And I know that it has click constants.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that we have a lot of South Africa experts who know the language here in Ukraine.
So let me tell you about this poem. I wrote the poem in English. And then another poet translated it into Xhosa. So there's actually the original English version, and then the other one is a translation of that poem, which was part of the process of kind of excavating. So I didn't write the Xhosa one; it's a translation.
But you want to. Once you want to.
Pardon?
Once you want to write in isiXhosa.
Yes. Poem. No, I do. So this specific one I didn't write myself, but there are other poems that I've started writing in isiXhosa.
And you learned the language, or it's just a home language which is used in your childhood? This upbringing. Where was isiXhosa in your upbringing, and where was English in your upbringing?
Right. So as I said earlier, I was born in 1986, and that was during the state of emergency in South Africa. And then Nelson Mandela was released in 1990. And when that happened, in those years, and perhaps a little bit earlier, the schools, because you had also different school education systems for the different races. So there were schools that were set aside for white children, for colored children, colored Indian children, Asian, and then Indian people are obviously Asian. And then black education system. So it was completely different. The education system was split according to race. And then in those years of the early 90s and the late 80s, they started letting black students into white schools. So that was part of the negotiation of democracy was actually that opening up of schools for black children. And so I went in 1992, I first went to, I think before that, 1991, I went to an isiXhosa school, right? So that was my first year of schooling. But then the second year, I went to an Afrikaans school. Now, Afrikaans is, it's kind of almost like a Creole of Dutch and sort of different languages, but that's used in South Africa. And I think for about 3 or 4 years, I was in an Afrikaans school. And then fourth grade, I went to an English school. So it's a very mixed kind of start into language. But when I went to the English school, we were not allowed to speak our mother tongues. So we weren't allowed to speak isiXhosa or whatever other language on school grounds. So in the school campus, you could only speak English during school hours. And then when you leave and go home, that's when you could speak your own language. But my mother, who was a teacher, was very adamant that we wouldn't lose isiXhosa. So she made sure that we would speak it at home. We could read the Bible in isiXhosa and we'd speak. So my ability to hold on to it is my parents. They were adamant that we wouldn't just speak English. So there's kind of that tension where social mobility in the world meant speaking English. But at home, my parents said, okay, we want you to be able to speak English, but you're also going to hold on to your mother tongue. So that poem is about that kind of, the way in which I brought up was really quite mixed in terms of language. And sometimes it makes me feel unsettled, like I don't quite belong to either one, because I don't always have full access to English. It's, culturally, it's not, I speak the language, but it's not my culture. And then you have isiXhosa culture, but I don't have full access into the language. So that's why I say it's always this in-betweenness that I'm grappling with. Yeah.
I think it's good time to listen to this poem.
Okay. So I'm going to read the poem first in English, and then I'll read the isiXhosa translation. Because I also want you to hear all the clicks and sort of hear what the language sounds like. All right. If it's all right, I'm going to turn my camera a bit. I see the sun is moving into my face. Is that okay? Let me do this. All right. So this poem is called Making Bread. When all is mixed to dough, I hold a pinch of every isiXhosa poem I write up to my mother's mouth to knead between her teeth. We deliberate on dry ingredients, that idiom here, this translation there, these puns here, and those ones there. But she is mum on my substitution of self-rising flour for yeast, knows it is the best I can do in the circumstance of a tongue baked in surrogacy. Every December, in exchange for a Tupperware full of Worcestercook tried over coals, I present Umama with English poems to match the decadence of the season. English, with its heavy hand of sugar, corrodes my vernacular. English poems do not let me forget that this bowl I work in is borrowed. When we break bread at the kitchen table, we slather slices of my mother's tongue with margarine, steer it along a steaming tide of rooibos tea or a glass sweating with ice and oros. I do not know how to make this meal last me all year long. I want to pray in isiXhosa. Give us this day our daily bread, and when we commune with you, never let us need grace again. And there's a Xhosa version. Xa konke sele kuxoviwe kwayintlama, ndicuntsula kuyo yonke imibongo endiyibhala ngesiXhosa, ndiyisondeze emlonyeni kamama. Ayityabeke phakathi kwamazinyo akhe sicamnce ngezithako ezisilelayo. Esa saci sibeke phaya, le nguqulelo yibeke apha, ezi zidlala imagama zibeke apha kwaye wongeze eziya phaya. Kodwa ziyamkrokrisa izibambeli zomgubo ozinyukelayo endaweni yegwele. Uyazi kuko konke endikunokwenza phantsi kwale meko yolwimi lemboleko. Rhoqo ngoDisemba, xa ndincwase isitya sikaTupperware esigcwele irostile ezivavanywe emalahleni, ndiye ndabele umama imibongo yesiNgesi, ukuyelelanisa iziyolo zeli xesha lonyaka. IsiNgesi nokucherha kwaso sidlekisa ulwimi lwam lenkobe. Imibongo yesiNgesi iyala ndibale ndilibale, ukuba esi sitya singqukuva ndixovela kuso sesemboleko. Xa siqhekeza isonka etafileni yasekhitshini, sidyobha ulwimi lukamama ngemajarini. Silukhaphele ecaleni komphunga wetiye rooibos, okanye silulumele ngeglasi ebandayo oros. Andazi ningasonga njani esi sidlo sikwazi ukusithwala unyaka wonke. Ndinomnqweno wokuthandaza ngesiXhosa. Siphe namhlanje isonka sethu semihla ngemihla, kwaye sithi sakumanyana nawe, ungaze usiyeke silambathe inceba kwakhona.
Thank you very much. And what does it mean to write poetry using language which is not so open to understanding as English?
So I think it's two-part. One thing I forgot to mention is that when I write in isiXhosa, which is part of the subject of the poem, is I actually call my mom. If I'm unsure about words, I call my mom. So there's a collaborative effort in the recovery that I'm trying to do, because she was a language teacher. And so I will literally call and say, Mom, I'm trying to say this. What is the best way? And I actually love that process. It's almost like a collaboration. Sometimes even my dad will get involved and I send voice notes of, is this the right idiom that I'm using for this poem? And then they come back to me and say, hey, you haven't spelled it correctly. What do you mean? And so there's actually been a very, it's almost like a communal aspect to me trying to write in isiXhosa, is that I have to consult with my parents. I have to bring them into that process. I think in terms of access, it's only inaccessible to people who don't speak isiXhosa. So for my Xhosa audiences, where I come from especially, there's actually more access for them in the Xhosa poetry than in my English poetry, especially if I'm in the rural areas. I try and make sure that if there's some event, then I actually try and find and speak to the Xhosa poetry, because I know if there's an 80 or 90-year-old Xhosa granny in the audience, I want her to have access. And so I'm likely to do the Xhosa poems. In terms of other audiences, filming has allowed us to use subtitles. in some of the cases. So when we use subtitles, that gives a little bit of access. Recently, I did a poem for graduation where I asked another friend of mine to translate the poem. And so that kind of, again, extends it into a communal practice that we're engaged in. I think other than that, access for me is about, this is what we're trying to do as well, especially because of the impact of colonialism, is that if people don't have access, especially in South Africa, we invite them to go and do the work of translation and trying to figure out, speak to someone who speaks this language and ask to interpret this for you. And I think that broadens their own knowledge base as well.
I have the one and only time when I hear this click in language. It was when I saw with my dad the film "The Gods Must Be Crazy." I don't know whether you know this film.
I knew that film.
Yeah, I know that its film is really post-colonial film, and the way people in Europe or in Western world used to understand or to see people in South Africa, but it was I do not remember the plot of the film, but I remember this click.
Yes.
And it is like things with two sides. From one side, it's very interesting, and people want to look more close to the language and to the culture. But in the same way, it is very. It is easy to show yourself and your culture and your identity as exotic, and and in this way as a colonial. Do you try to find somehow the way to avoid this situation, to avoid be treated as exotic only when you use Xhosa language?
That's such a great question. And I think that film in particular is evidence of that time in history, right? Because now we look at it and it's very problematic, like that kind of portrayal. But I think we can't really control reception. We can only control intention. So in terms of how I put it out, even for example in this conversation, knowing that you won't understand, or the audience won't understand the language itself, what is important for me is the sound, right? And being and that unfamiliarity that kind of repositions the listener away from the familiar, right? And that for me is work that even I enjoy doing, because I'm a theater maker and in film as well, is that being able to access meaning from something other than language, or rather, understanding what the dictionary definition of a word, but actually being able to access meaning in performance, being able to access meaning in the auditory experience. So finding other ways and making the listener uncomfortable with their own, with not being able to access the text. And so for me, I love being able to shift that a little bit and say, hey, there are other ways of how we make meaning. So how do we do that? How comfortable are you with not knowing? And being able to find other ways of access. So when it comes to being seen as exotic, I think that's not fully up to me, right? It's somewhat in the hands of the audience, or in the hands of the reader, and their perspective of the world. Now, my job is to try and open the mind of the listener and how they think. And if they don't even realize that they're positioning me as the subject of this, as the exotic subject in a way that's problematic and colonial, which it is, in the content of the work itself, or in the conversation outside of the poem, because it's also like, how do we speak about the text itself? And that's where we do the work of saying, hey, I have autonomy, and my language, that's what I was saying. it's maybe inaccessible to someone who doesn't speak that language. But to someone who speaks Xhosa, that's the height of access. So they're able to understand the imagery. They're able to get access into the metaphors and the idioms because we actually share a history that I don't share with an audience who doesn't speak Xhosa. So actually, the audience who may see me as exotic is on the back foot because they don't have access. So yeah, I not fully able to control that, but I always try and kind of contextualize the work that I'm doing. That it's not a gimmick, it's not a trick. It's not like, oh, I'm just reading his causa so that it's out there. I'm contextualizing why that matters to me.
This click, does it have some, it's just a phonetical thing, or it has some special meaning?
Oh no, it's certainly phonetic. So it's also got a history. It's also got a history in that it comes from, I think it comes from the Khoi people, who are actually the first people of South Africa, the first sort of indigenous people of South Africa. And they have, so the clicks that you heard in The Gods Must Be Crazy were probably more from the Khoi people than from Xhosa. So we actually borrowed the clicks from them as we were, as we were just kind of moving into the country and mixing and so on. So yeah, phonetically that's how they're more phonetic in the language. It's I think we have 3 clicks, yes. X, Q, and C.
Wow. And it sounds very similar to the sounds of nature. And it's some theoretics in post-structural studies. They talk about language like very important part of the human being, which a human being tried to destinate from nature things. And this click shows this connection with nature and connection and language, this our phonetical languages and so on and so forth. They are somehow destinate us not only from nature, but from real senses of many things and from real sense of our consciousness. And when I listen to you, when I was listening to your poems, I think about this going closer to the things and senses of things. Sorry for my Ukrainian English.
I understand.
Yeah, it's my part of exotic. my post-colonial story. Do you have somehow studies of isiXhosa language, and do you know whether experts exist?
Yes, many. Universities. The University of Cape Town, where I studied and worked, had a Xhosa department. So it's I think we have 11 official languages in South Africa. So
but abroad in the world, somehow in Europe or in the United States.
I'm not sure. I think there might be. I know that in the Northwestern University, I think it's in Chicago, they have a library of South African literature. And I know that there's some work that's happening there. I don't know if there's a lot of studies that are happening, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are, because some libraries do actually have collections of some of our literature.
Now I want to talk with you not about very new thing, about your film We Are Dying Here. It is inspired by your poem written in 2018 in response to the issue of gender-based violence in South Africa, and then adapted into a stage performance, and then subsequently reworked into a film. What does it mean to change your own poem into a film?
Oh my goodness. I think it's okay. So because I already work in poetry and I work in the theater. It's part of that. Part of it is part of what I do, right? And it's not too distant, especially because I've always been interested in the choreo poem. And we think about, I think probably the most famous one is For Colored Girls by Ndoza Kishange. That is probably the most, because it went to Broadway and so on. But that fusion of poetry, theater, dance, music, right? So bringing that, and not just being sort of straight theater. So that's something that I already do. The biggest part of that was actually collaboration. What was really important was bringing in other creatives. So Hope Nechibambe, who's also a poet, I brought her on the project, and then Baba Lamagwet, who's a musician. And so it actually became a collaborative experience where we brought in the poetry that we had around the subject matter. It involved a lot of conversation in the process of adaptation, sort of being able to pull out all the motifs and all the things that we wanted to really speak to, and then to actually also rewrite. And I think Hope will tell you, it was the first time for her working in the theater. And I would just tell her, she'd be reading, and I'd say, okay, we're going to cut that. We're going to cut that whole thing because it has to fit. And so there's something almost brutal in that process where the poem now can no longer have its own life. It has to live in conjunction and in collaboration, conversation with other pieces. And so that literally meant moving lines around. It meant tearing it apart, sometimes cutting things and saying it's about the bigger story. It's about the plot that we're trying to follow. When it came to adapting for film, we had to bring in more collaborators, which was the filmmaker, the director, and the producer of the short film, where now they came in with a different perspective of thinking, how is this going to work in front of a camera? How is this going to work? So sometimes what we were able to do on stage wasn't going to read well on screen. So they had to think about, okay, how are we going to shoot this? What is it going to mean? How are we going to move these different scenes? And so it was about letting go of control and actually, having the people who have expertise in that field being able to say, hey, okay, this worked on stage, this worked as a poem, but now, I have to bring in, we had these scenes where like running down the road or in this water house and all of these things. And so it's almost like translation, but now you're translating for the medium. It's not the language that's being translated, it's the form. And thinking about, okay, this poem actually doesn't work now. It doesn't work like this because we're going to be shooting it on the roof and this is going to happen after. So now we have to rethink, we have to pare it down again, so it's not an easy process, but one I absolutely enjoy.
And now I think is a next great moment to hear your poetry. So, dear guests, you are now on 28th Lviv Book Forum, and in a second, Sipоказі Йонас will start performing her poetry, especially for Hasashiyan program Writers in Insights.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I think you can.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Just because I'm realizing you only see my face now.
Yeah. Зараз закриємо шторку. I will say to. Ми закриємо шторку і повернемось до читання.
Ага, добре.
All right, that is so much better.
But sun was signs of sun was very beautiful, I think.
Yeah. It was burning my face. Nice. Yeah. So how many poems? I mean, not how many poems, but how long? Sort of.
We have something like 25, 30 minutes.
Okay.
So everything I think you have enough time to read everything you want to read.
Okay. Honestly, I have about 15 minutes. Is that
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. All right. All right, so I'm going to read a variety of poems, some that speak to, the state of the country and some of the things that we're experiencing, and others of a lot more personal nature, and my own musings and my own questions that I'm grappling with. The first one is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek poem around our obsession, what used to be our obsession with the figure of Nelson Mandela, and the hype of democracy. It's changed a lot since then, though. South Africa, you are a country desperate for celebration. Your anxiety with history compels you to pierce yourself, to carve a praise poem inside your bones. Your anthem bruises itself out of a throat pregnant with stones. Is it any wonder that the dance of democracy burdens your ankle bones when you commemorate among moving gravestones, with no concern for the restless names there and how they came to be here? You love to stitch heroes for yourself, spooling your thread from Vezo to Houghton by way of Robben Island into the blind eye of patriotism. You would sew for 100 years if you could, and Frankenstein the life of one man to fashion yourself a costume appropriate for the occasion. The world is watching, you say, while you amputate names and knots from freedom's apron, and then forget promptly how to undo yourself when you are alone. You do not know how to be alone with who you are and who you wish to be. You dress yourself in the worship of memory and heroes, and then shorten the hem of their humanity. A land with legs so long you cannot know how the nakedness of your ankles betrays your anxiety with history. One ankle denies it, the other rereads it. The other is dancing while one protests. You are being undone. Do not clothe this injured self without sitting in the presence of the wound. Listen to all it has to say in blood. Leave time for the bones to bear witness to their trauma. How else can you know that a praise poem ripens and blooms inside the shadow of a funeral song? Mampele's harvest. My grandmother was a guardian who tended a kingdom of cabbages, leafy, layered planets that were in constant orbit, Emasimini. Umampele was a general rearing a battalion of survival at 50 cents a head. In imitation of Genesis, she could craft a field into her image long before the sun had sobered to rise. Her husband, Ungoche, was himself a spade, toiling in the tunnels of Jozi, the colon of Gauteng, which is constipated with gold and the bodies of black men, spewing them out in opposite directions, one to the bus, but the other to the grave. My grandfather was an intercessory prayer, praying in pics, his penance paid inside a rock. His sweat would flow like rivers of provision and sacrifice, but sometimes like signals of smoke all the way to a case Gamahok, where they were funneled into grandmother's veins of steel and a back as broad as the mountains of Ukoboko. Here she would midwife a harvest, all Canaan-like, all big-headed paradise-like. This cabbage connoisseur could craft 7 variations of cabbage dishes. There were revelations between those leaves, chopped fine like sermons. Umakhulu notamkhulu babengabantu bomhlaba. So my inheritance lay underneath their fingernails. Even now when it rains, I find that I crave the soil 3 times a day. Some call it anemia, but I know it to be communion. My mother is a pillar of soil. With tendrils for fingers, the plants at home gravitate towards her as if she is the sun setting into the room. Perhaps they are descendants of cabbages, packed solar system tight on the back of Ibagya Mampinga on Saturday mornings where grandmother's soldiers rattled along to the backtrack of an exhaust pipe, harmonizing 50 cents, 50 cents a makepech, 50 cents, 2 for 1 rand. But now, she must study agriculture in Afrikaans. This mother of mine, who can swing a hoe in cursive with more finesse than a pencil, who learned the cradle of the land from the canyons in her parents' hands, must learn the one thing she understands in a language her tongue does not. 1988. Grandfather's body turns to gold, 6 feet deep. But he will not be mined. 1992, Jon Foster Primary School. I was one of the first blacks in an Afrikaans school, all dolled up in white and blue, a sign of a South African new. Juffrou reads out the register, and non-existent cliques intimidate her. Siphokazi Yonas. Sifo means disease. Kazi, big disease Jonas. Here, ma'am, my father would explain, 1995, still in white and blue, but now with added red, where English schools were a new means to an end, and on introduction night, our names sat on our tongues like trays, but flashback, Siphokazi Yonas, perhaps a twang would be the antidote. Hi guys, my name is Siphokazi Jonas, and laughter rolls off the other trays. They say she's trying to be white. 1999. My sister, a new recruit to a post-TRC world where searching for a better life still left us sitting on the back of Umkwesi's baki, his red botsotso baki, as red as our ties. We too are cabbages. 2001, grandmother is planted 6 feet deep. She will not be harvested. Now, my mother is proud of how finely I chop cabbages. She says, it's the time and care that I take to disassemble planets. I want to read something about my dad for a second. Actually, I'll read 2 short poems about my dad, but also just sort of Black fatherhood. In the anthology of Black experiences, the Black father poem is always missing or leaving. That is meta for absence. Censored for violence and abuse, this kind of Black father poem always wins awards and standing ovations in theaters. If the Black father poem is also a play and has been to prison, then he will return to be a punchline in a joke and a pun. As if there are no first-time poems, strapping firstborn daughters into car seats and holding doors open for their wives. Retired poems like mine, who gardens with my mother, threatens to leave but still waits in the car. Where are the detective poems to investigate the spine of torn-out pages? In remission. 340 milliliters of stony ginger beer between my sister and me is an effervescent ocean to be split without discrimination, 1 sip at a time. Then me, then her, then me, then her. We say a splash on your shirt is still a turn. Then her, then me, then me, then her, then me. This was a coup in the expansive stern of the 1988 Audi, my father's first car. In this scene, in the threat of a rapidly drying seabed on the inside of the can, even mother agrees, why did he only buy one? In another scene, where I am looking back and I can afford my own 340 milliliters of Stony ginger beer and his, it is the end of the month. There is just enough for one. He makes us Moses splitting a can of cool drink in two. My father does not ask for a turn. We do not offer. That February summer, I have reason to learn that cancer and the color green have the same root word. In isiXhosa, it is plaza, and to be green is to be rude. Cancer is rude. 2015 took the longest draft out of our lungs, and we sip at breath. I remember us putting the phone on loudspeaker after his chemotherapy, and speech bubbled between us, then him, then us, then him. Everyone took their turn to speak, and we are all still here. Back to language for a little bit. And the title of this poem is Big Shoes. Do you remember playing dress up in Mama's two big shoes and bag, and how her satin blouse wore you to the knees? Eventually, you grow into her, then outgrow things that neither of you are willing to undress. You are still an imposter in your mother's tongue. There are things you want to unpack out of this bag, but you don't have the language to do so. When you write in isiXhosa, you feel as if everyone is looking at how tight and narrow English is on your feet, rubbing you so raw, you are now a bone out of place and a bunion of cultures at war. All you want is to wear your mother tongue around town without limping. I think I'll share, let me actually share the poem that was the catalyst for the stage production, the short film, We Are Dying Here. And this poem is entitled, Thanks for the Hashtag, But, and it's always in honor of the many, many people that we've lost to gender-based violence in South Africa, which is an ongoing scourge. So this is Thanks for the Hashtag, But. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet between taxi rank, construction site, and street. Only enough time to clutch your bag to your body to yourself, and yourself to this thought, please don't talk to me. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet in the boardroom or by the photocopy machine. Power pinches the purse strings and makes you puppet. And everybody knows the puppet master's hands like to slip below the neck, below the hem, below the waist. But the show must go on. So the audience claps and claps and claps its way to a 13th check. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet in vestry or confession booth. Scriptures are interpreted behind smoke screens, between a collar and a robe, and the pulpit is now a bookshelf of bodies, and God was cast out a long time ago to make space. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet in parliament or court. They're in the business of cooking laws to make justice for the vulnerable. But first, a few questions to establish your innocence. Did you say no? Do your clothes say no? Your values, your virtues, your life, how long have you lived as a no? Because what matters is not what she says, it's what he believes he heard. So thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet. There's no network here. Data is expensive here. How do you explain Twitter here? Or a hashtag for that matter, when my aunt, my cousin, and my grandmother don't speak English here? There's no time to tweet here. The police ask what I did to deserve it here. The docket is for sale here. The family wants to solve this as a family here. They pay damages to make things right here. The lecturer fails you here. The principal is king here. The prophet is father here. The breadwinner must not be questioned here. The bread must not be endangered here. The neighbors mind their own business here. They say, I'll ruin the family here. They say, begezela here. They say, don't try, be clever here. They say, they'll teach me a lesson here. They say they want to fix me here. They say, smile here. The trend is hashtag, we are dying here. And I will finish off with the pandemic poem that you mentioned. I think it's worth sharing. This is What Does Not Sink. Ufikile unogumbe, ugalelekile. Akankonkozi udilize ukubasi. There is a flood inside our house. The water climbs up the walls when we weep. It does not let us breathe. Everything is wet with grief. Before this pandemic, we would cast a funeral song into the dark like a flare, and the neighbors would come to strengthen our arms as we drove the water out the door before grief reached our ankles, before it swept us to our knees, before it flowed into the pots and our beds. To mourn meant a community gathered like a bank between you and the river of death. Now death has dampened this ritual. Alone. The neighbors lift their own arms to relieve the water in their lungs. We are all drowning. This flood has reached into the inner rooms and quenched lives, young and old. It has taken what we are not ready to lose. It spits the stories of the living into the street as injured furniture. The pensioner in line for a social grant, whose life has no space to protest a beach, still she returns home, clothes soaked. The man who dies for a beer in his own backyard. The nurse tying a tattered mask together with prayer and is still unprotected. The artist who contemplates eating her own words to ease her hunger, and art starves. This flood ruins us all. But what of the after? When the depth of this moment is absorbed into history, who will we be? We are a people who know how to rebuild out of the remnants of disaster, and we will do it again and again. When we salvage what is usable, may we find ourselves baptized into something new with new ways of mourning, a people who have learned to breathe underwater, reciting the names of those we have lost and memories that never sink. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure that for now it is the best poem about pandemic times in all languages in which I can read. And once you said, my role as a poet is to interrogate a lot of things. It's to highlight, it's to question, and it's to challenge as much as I can. To read and to write poetry, both is a challenge, yes?
Yes.
So it was 28th Lviv International Book Forum. It was an online event in Hasashiyan program on Lviv Book Forum, Writers Insights, and it was supported by Ukrainian Cultural Fund and Center for Creative Arts, University KwaZulu-Natal, and we met extraordinary great Sipоказі Yonas, writer, poet, performer, and producer from South Africa. Thank you very much. It was great.